Welcome again to another MLA productivity and profitability webinar. So these are a series of webinars designed to deliver pertinent topics for beef, sheep and goat producers, mainly with a focus on the southern pastoral regions of Australia. My name is Peter Haviland and I work for the webinar coordinators, Aggregate Consulting. And tonight we'll be looking at carbon, and how producers can be carbon neutral. So again, the focus of tonight's topic is to again focus on what you can do in the present as a producer, rather than talk about theory and abstract concepts not relevant to the day-to-day running of your business. Before we get into the introduction, and I'll hand over to Richard, our presenter, I'll just quickly go through the platform with anyone who's not familiar. So essentially all you've got to do is sit back and listen tonight. You don't have to worry about video cameras or anything. And so you can get optimum viewing. I draw your attention to the orange button, which allows you to minimize your toolbar so you can see Richard's presentation fully. The other thing I will flag with you is that you can ask questions as they arise. So you'll see, again, you'll have to have your toolbar expanded for this. Yeah, we can collate them and then Richard will address them at the end of the presentation. If you do have to leave, we do record these webinars and they'll be available there for your future reference. The final thing we ask of you, we really value your feedback throughout this program. There's a short survey at the end of the event. So yeah, if you have the time, we really appreciate it. So that's enough from me. I'll quickly get into our introduction. So Richard Eckard joins us from the University of Melbourne, and his resume is a sizable one. So as well as his role with Melbourne University, he's also a member and director of the Primary Industries Climate Change Centre. Richard is an innovator in this space. He was the first to develop greenhouse gas accounting tools for agriculture, and his list of peer-reviewed papers, chapter books, it's almost endless. He's consulted to governments, both Australia, New Zealand, in the EU, and numerous world organisations. So we're pretty lucky to have Richard here. He's definitely an influential scientist, making Reuters list recently as one of the most 1,000 influential climate scientists. So again, pretty big resume, and we really look forward to hearing Richard's insights tonight. I'll hand over to him now. Richard, you should see your invite very shortly.
Great, thanks, Peter, and good evening, everyone. A few nervous moments there for a while, but I think we're on track.
Yes, so I can hear
the presentation.
Yep. And I can hear you well. Thanks, Richard. I'll go on mute.
I'll stop my webcam because everyone has seen me before, and let's just talk about how producers can be carbon neutral. Peter, is it all showing okay? Ready to go? Okay. So let's get into the topic at hand. Why carbon neutral is the first thing I like to deal with. Who's actually asking us to be carbon neutral, and where's the drive coming from? And I'd probably point us back to the Paris Climate Agreement. I mean, there were a lot of events that happened prior to this, but this is the first time that there was a global agreement between countries to achieve a climate neutral world. Now, note it says climate neutral, not carbon neutral. We've assumed carbon neutral, but it actually means climate neutral. In other words, no further warming of the atmosphere rather than elimination of all greenhouse gases. So it assumes net zero, but it's not required. In other words, short-lived gases like methane don't have to be zero to achieve a climate neutral outcome. Then the most recent agreement in Glasgow, COP26, increased short-term ambitions. So this is what you see now coming through in Labour policy of the new government, saying we won't just commit to net zero by 2050, we'll have something like a 46%, 47% reduction in emissions by 2030. Now, I want to switch the tack a little bit, because we talk about government and we talk about government targets. We've heard governments talk about setting targets, and we've heard debates from the left and right about do we or don't we set targets. And I would say to you that's completely irrelevant, because government tends to operate on the left-hand side of this curve, not on the right-hand side. So government typically works on the left-hand side to pick up laggards and try to sort of come in with moving people more to the middle of the distribution. What we're seeing in the climate change area is the right-hand side is where supply chains and innovative companies try to differentiate themselves and lead the way. And so asking governments about targets when we are mainly an export agriculture industry becomes a little bit of a moot point. We should look at what the supply chain are telling us. And so some of you might have seen this before. 10 years ago, I had a screen like this. It was all emissions intensity metrics on this. But since the Paris Agreement, we've seen all these multinational supply chain companies switch their language and saying, well, Paris says absolute commitments. And so you've got absolute commitments appearing here on the screen. And some of you will be familiar with Unilever or Fonterra or JBS having set targets for absolute reductions. Now, note, most of these targets are starting somewhere around 2030, which is consistent with the Paris Agreement for short-term ambition. Also notably for the red meat industries is that the ones with stars have also included a switch into plant-based protein rather than animal-based protein in their supply chain. Now, it says webinar closed by, anyway, I'll keep going.
You're fine, Richard. I've just stopped your video. We're having some bandwidth issues.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I think this switch into plant-based protein is kind of misguided, and we can talk about that in the chat later, but it is what the perception is, that switching into plant-based protein will reduce our emissions. It kind of ignores we can do something about livestock emissions anyway. Having said all that, there's been a lot of action recently, more from the banks, for example, where two of the major banks that hold 50% of the agri-debt market are saying they want net zero financed emissions by 2050. They don't want the exposure of greenhouse gas emissions in their loan portfolio. I'll show you why in a moment. But a comment in the Financial Times that appeared from an Oxfam survey tells us what we know. 100 of the largest economies in the world are companies. 69 of the largest 100 economies are companies, not countries. So we know that Microsoft and Amazon are bigger than half of the countries in the world in terms of their economy. And so we in Australia should be more concerned about what the supply chain is telling us about future targets. And government policy may be less influential. Now, in case you think this doesn't really matter, these are the kind of things that institutional investors are being shown, where what you've got here is the Farm Animal Risk and Return Investment Report submitted to the London Stock Exchange. And it lists all the publicly listed livestock corporations, supply chain companies in the world, from good to bad performance. Now, I won't go into the details, but there's a number of Australian companies in there, and Fonterra pops up on the left-hand side. 4 from the left is Fonterra, because they had some intent in their sustainability statement. But some Australian livestock companies pop up on the right-hand side of this diagram. They are, what this is advising institutional investors of the risk of exposure to greenhouse gas emissions of investing in livestock agriculture. Now, you can think that's right or wrong, but that's what's being advised. We've also seen some interesting developments in the dairy industry, and I would say the dairy industry is more vulnerable, I think, in this area than, say, the red meat industries. I think alternatives to red meat and meat lab-based proteins are so far off. It's that's a furphy, really. But there are viable alternatives coming through in dairy that could be real competition for the industry. We've seen Danone, one of the largest supply chain companies, invest in the alternative milk products. Now, I'm not too concerned about that. That's a niche product, but when you look at what their website says and you read it in the counterfactual, they're basically saying these products on the top right are more sustainable and healthier than traditional dairy milk. That's how you read it in the reverse. And we know that Norco, one of the third largest dairy supply companies in Australia, has formed a partnership with CSIRO to produce milk from precision yeast fermentation, a company called Eden Brew. Now, again, you might say, well, will that take over dairy? Maybe not, but read the statement there in the counterfactual. In other words, if this is what they're saying, that this yeast fermentation is more sustainable and less resource intensive than traditional dairy, it's a blight on the dairy industry and could be a real challenge for livestock production. Now, what we've seen is a number of responses to this environment. And I would say, while a very brave statement at the beginning that red meat in Australia can be carbon neutral, at least putting a target out there is quite an ambitious stake in the ground, saying we need to actually do something. And why is this happening? Well, because our competitors around the world are doing the same thing. We've seen at least the state of Mato Grosso do Sul set a carbon neutral initiative and launch a brand of carbon neutral Brazilian beef. It's being sold in the European market. We've seen New Zealand set targets that include agriculture, notably not setting a zero target for methane, and that's actually quite significant. But all farmers in New Zealand are required to complete a carbon audit by the end of this calendar year, indicating that if they don't, they would be part of the emissions reduction, the emissions trading scheme. We've also seen New Zealand, California cap methane at 40% less by 2030. And if you think of California, we have large confinement dairies there. We have large feedlots in California, all under pressure to reduce methane by at least 40% by 2030. So this is happening, and it is very real. And it's linked to a global methane pledge that came out of the Glasgow Agreement that we would see 30% less methane by 2030, signed up to by 105 countries. Now, look at the list over here, and you'll see there's a commonality of 30 to 40% less methane coming out from a number of these targets, because that's about the reduction in methane needed to achieve climate neutrality, not carbon neutrality, and that's quite important. Now, in response, we've seen a number of livestock products offering carbon neutral products, including Coles being the latest one. Just need to say something about that, because there's been some backlash in the media about Coles, which I find very unfortunate. They did the right thing. They went and bought Australian carbon credit units. It just so happens that where they bought them from was a project that's now being called into question, but that's not Coles's problem. It's actually the government's problem, because all Australian carbon credit units are meant to be equal. It doesn't matter where you buy them from, so don't blame Coles, in other words. But there's also sort of throwing the opposite example in of wine companies that are offering carbon neutral products. To be honest, it's a lot easier for a wine company when there's 95% of the emissions are from energy consumption in washing bottles compared to livestock methane, so a whole lot different target. We've also heard about border adjustment tariffs, and you can read on the screen here a statement by the US President, Joe Biden, and another one by the European Environment Minister, EU Environment Minister, on the CBAM legislation, basically saying, unless you can show an equal ambition, we'll have to tax you. Now, I think the heat might be going out of that for Australia at the moment with the change in government, without making any political statements about that, but it just does change the international perspective of Australian produce. So it leaves us with a trade exposure here that if we cannot meet the ambition of the markets we're trying to meet and market into, we would have to pay a border adjustment tariff. Or we take that same money and we invest it in low emissions agriculture, and we beat the ambition of our competitors. Now, we've actually done that in Australia in the canola market, having demonstrated that canola in Australia is produced with half the emissions that the EU can produce it. And so Australian canola is already getting a premium access into the EU market because of our low emissions. So we've done it before, we can do it again. Now, just some warnings on carbon credits. While there might be some access to premium markets being carbon neutral, for example, we've done some audits on carbon neutral wool that have allowed access to premium markets. When these supply chain targets start kicking in at about 2030, future compliance will, the price advantage might actually disappear, and it might just be about insetting, in other words, keeping your carbon against your own liability so that you can access the supply chain and meet the requirements. And that carbon credits after 2030 will not be traded out of agriculture. We will only be allowed to use them into what we call hard to abate sectors. So the notion of now getting short-term gain out of selling soil carbon, for example, is quite a dangerous practice, I would put it to you, because there's a fundamental difference between carbon sequestration offset, which, if you think about it, soil carbon and tree carbon, it's a finite stock. It builds up in the soil to a certain degree and can't keep building up indefinitely. And the more you sell out of that finite resource to the supply chain, and more you sell to Microsoft, for example, it leaves your farm, it leaves the industry, it leaves the country, and it goes outside the country. Then one day when you need that soil carbon against your own low carbon credentials, it's gone. It'll never come back. Whereas selling, say, a methane reduction, if your animals go to market 3 months early, that's 3 months of methane they didn't produce. There's no permanence obligation. There's no contract to look after that for the next 100 years. You could sell that methane reduction with almost impunity up until the day that the supply chain requires you to show low carbon production, and then you just keep it. You don't sell it anymore because it happens on a daily basis. So you need to appreciate the difference between selling a finite stock of carbon like soil carbon. There's quite a big risk. And soil carbon is 80% leveraged on rainfall in Australia. So don't get lured into the idea that this is some gold mine sitting at the end of the rainbow. It's not. Whereas methane reduction, very secure, and the investors are wising up to that, understanding that there's a big risk difference between buying something that is heavily dependent on rainfall versus something that either did or didn't happen and you have impunity with buying it. Now, what about carbon farming? What do we do next as an industry? What we've got to do next is all of us have to understand, well, what is our baseline? What are we working from? What is our emissions from our farming system? And there are tools we can provide you for that. One thing to note, and don't get caught by this, no one's asking you to be carbon neutral by tomorrow. These supply chain targets are only starting by 2030. They're not saying you have to be carbon neutral by 2030. So there's a lot of room to move with research coming through delivering solutions for the industry. If you wanted to start your journey on this, you would say, let's do the strategies we can now for reducing methane. What can we do tomorrow? And I'll come to that in a moment. But realizing that, yes, you can plant trees, you can build soil carbon, but these are finite options. You will run out of trees, you will run out of soil carbon in the near future because they are finite, they're not long-term options. And then you'll realize that soon enough, you can run out of soil carbon as an offset, but the methane will continue unless we do something about it. So just a warning on engaging in carbon credit trading. Like I said, if it's a methane credit, you can sell it up until the day you need to be carbon neutral. But you can't sell it and claim to be low carbon. You can't sell your soil carbon and still claim to be carbon neutral. Get independent advice. Beware of snake oil sales around. Don't sell your soil carbon. You may need it for your own supply chain access by 2030. I thought it really important, and if I get nothing across other than this, let me just explain this diagram, because there's a lot of producers saying, well, why don't I get given a credit for the carbon I capture out of photosynthesis and lock into my pastures? You've got to realize when you look at this diagram, what you're looking for is where does carbon stop in the landscape for decadal time steps? It stops in trees, it might stop in the soil, and will stop in methane. The rest of the carbon goes into the soil, goes into the plant, and is back in the atmosphere within 12 months. There is no magical store of carbon that you can get a credit for. If we had to do that in our carbon accounting, we'd have a big account on the left-hand side for all the photosynthesis, and it would disappear on the right-hand side of the ledger, straight back to the atmosphere where it came from. Let me explain that. Carbon comes in as CO2 out of the atmosphere into the plant. Note it goes from CO2, which is a gas, into CHO, which is a sugar. So it's no longer carbon in the same form. So carbon is not carbon. Yes, some of it goes back as respiration, straight back to the atmosphere as CO2. Most of what your cows are breathing out is just CO2. So they eat CO2 that came out of the atmosphere as a sugar, they burn it off as heat energy, and it goes back to the atmosphere. A small amount goes back as methane, which hangs around in the atmosphere for at least a decade. Now, there's some fecal carbon that goes into the soil, very transient form of carbon. There's a litter that drops on the soil surface, again, a very friable form of carbon. The microbes love that. They feed on it. They release it back as CO2 back to the atmosphere. There's a small amount of carbon that then is put into the roots by sugars and by roots growing down, and certainly grazing management helps better soil carbon be laid down. But what's the purpose of that? Well, the purpose is it goes into a very fast pool of carbon, and some of it translates into a slower pool of carbon called the mineral-associated carbon. That's the long-term pool of carbon. What we want in healthy grazing systems is all of that to be in a very fast turnover pool as microbe food. That increases the amount of microbial biomass we have in our soils. We have healthier soils, better water holding. But what's the purpose of this? The purpose is that it can recycle nutrients back to the system as the microbes release it out to the atmosphere as CO2. And in a healthy ecosystem, that is just in a stable cycle. So it goes in as soil carbon, it builds up in the soil, the microbes feed on it and send it back as CO2, leaving a fairly constant stock of carbon behind in the system. That stock of carbon is leveraged on rainfall and clay. It's not really leveraged much on your management in permanent pasture systems. Now, what's the purpose of carbon farming? Well, it's to produce product. So the question is, how efficient are you in your livestock system in capturing CO2 into a plant, putting it into the soil or into an animal, and getting it out down the supply chain as meat, wool, milk, or grain? And so when you look at this cycle, you see some numbers here, which I'll leave in the recording for you. But the point is, if you're growing a 14-ton pasture, you're putting 7 tons of that into the soil, into the system as carbon. But not of that all goes into soil carbon because, well, if you graze it properly, 5 tons go to the animal. You can't put 5 tons into the soil and have 5 tons to the animal. You've got to allocate most of that pasture through to proper grazing management. And so you end up with only a small amount, less than 1 ton can possibly go into soil carbon in any 1 year, because the rest is all part of a neutral cycle that will recycle the CO2 back to the atmosphere. So I hope you can see that if we can get rid of methane from animals, this cycle becomes a positive cycle, not a negative cycle. And that's where we're trying to aim with the research. Just a few thoughts on carbon accounting. And that is, carbon accounts can be an account on the business unit, in other words, the farm itself, which is the farm boundary and all its greenhouse gas emissions minus the annual change in soil and tree carbon. It's not the total carbon, because you can't count it twice. It's only the degree by which it changes every 12 months. We know about carbon footprints, which is the emissions intensity. In other words, it's the carbon per unit of product we produce, per ton of live weight, for example, or per ton of carcass weight. And then carbon neutrality is just saying, well, let's take one of those two and say if it's carbon neutral property, it's tons, net zero tons of CO2 emissions per hectare of land or per farm. Or if it's carbon footprint and carbon neutral wool, then it's tons of CO2 emissions per ton of wool that is zero. In other words, it's the carbon footprint is net zero. For those who want to start the journey, there's a number of tools on our website that I'll post at the end that can do all different combinations of production systems, and you can do your own carbon audit. If you want to know what your soil carbon and tree carbon is, you do need either direct measurement of the soil carbon over a time period, or you need an approved model like the Australian government's FullCam model. You can do a carbon audit on the greenhouse emissions on a 12-month period quite happily, but to do carbon stocks, you need to know what have you been doing for the last 20 years to get to the carbon stock you have in the soil or trees, and you need to know what the rainfall is going to do going forward from there to know where you are today, why you where you are, and where you have to go to. So the carbon stocks and fluxes are more complex analysis than just the greenhouse gas emissions. Just to finish off, I need to summarize what can be done, particularly about methane. We know this is a big challenge because the ruminant of the animal evolved about 50 million years ago, and we didn't know 30 years ago this was a problem. We've only just been on this challenge for about 30 years. And so adaptation is a massive challenge. If you look at the numbers I've given there of number of microbes, think about this, the number of bacteria. There's 10 to the power of 11, 10 with 11 zeros after it, of bacteria per milliliter of rumen fluid, and some other fungi and things. The soil is much the same composition as that. So when someone comes to you and says, we have this 250 grams of magical microbial mix we're going to stick in the rumen or the soil, and it's going to fundamentally change things, we're fighting 50 years worth of stable evolution here, and you're fighting 10 to the power of 11 microbes already there that are in stable ecosystem. Don't believe that kind of stuff. Now, what affects methane? It's really around passage rate, how fast that digester stays in the rumen. The longer the fiber stays there, the more time it has producing methane. So anything you can do to get it through quicker, get digestibility higher, improve forage quality, has a big impact. Now, if you look at the graph on the right, that's on the bottom left are rangeland cattle on very low quality forage in Northern Australia, not eating much, not producing much methane. Through to dairy cattle in Gippsland on the top right of the graph, eating 25 kilos of high lush ryegrass, high digestibility, but producing a lot of methane because they're producing a lot of milk. Now, our objective in the research is to say, well, what can we do about that 20.7? Can we change the slope of that line? And things like tannins, saponins, nitrates, sulfates, oils, all change the slope of the line. We've all heard about seaweed, which can make that line something of the nature of 5.3, for example, or oils can make that line 16 instead of 20. So I'm going to give you an example. It does come from Northern Australia, but it's a really neat example of how something simple like taking a grazing system that is nitrogen deficient and putting a legume into it. In this case, Leucaena in Northern Australia, but it could be crown vetch, it could be lotus, it could be Sulla or Bicerella in Southern Australia, where the left-hand graph says, well, you've got cows grazing on Rhodes grass, which is quite low nitrogen nutrition. And suddenly you bring a legume into the system, and Leucaena is a legume, a tree legume in Northern Australia. So suddenly the live weight gain is quicker, is faster with the more nutritious overall diet. So firstly, the first step on methane is those animals are finishing earlier, so there's less methane per kilogram of live weight. Then you switch to the right-hand side, and these legumes have got secondary compounds in them, like tannins, that actually reduce methane for every day the animal's eating them. So you switch into this Leucaena system, you finish the animals earlier, and they produce 20% less methane for every day they're grazing. Then there's a third benefit that we see. In this particular case study, because the grass pasture was deficient in nitrogen, the legume addressed that. You got better grass growth, you got better root growth out of the grass, and so soil carbon slowly kicked up over time because you had a healthier grass putting down deeper roots. And so simple things like getting legumes back into our pasture systems can have multiple effects on our emissions profile. So just to summarize and end off, there's some things we can do now just around making our livestock systems more efficient, about animal health, about fertility, about weaning rates. Some of the work I'm doing in East Africa is, what if we treated all the sheep in East Africa for roundworm, Haemonchus? There's a massive amount of methane reduction that can be saved in that process. I spoke about legumes, and they introduce these secondary compounds and improve the diet quality of the animal. Then there's supplements that we've looked at where you can feed oils or tannins or grape marc, which comes out of the wine industry, which has both tannin in the skin and oil in the seed. And you get a double whammy there. And there's commercial products that have these oils in them, like Mutral, Agalin, all reducing methane by somewhere between 10 and 20%. There's potential to breed for animals that produce less methane. And just when you think you've got it all under control, a company comes out called Zero Emissions Livestock Production. That's this diagram in the middle of the cow, where you've got a wearable device that oxidizes methane after the animal breathes out. But where do we go in the future? Well, New Zealand's really quite well advanced on a methane vaccine, which would really address some of the more extensive industries. We've all heard about seaweed and a product called 3-NOP or Bovier from DSM Nutrition. Both of them have high potential. Really, I guess the challenge here is how do we get these out into the more extensive grazing? And there is a series of grants out of the federal government right now called the Merrill grants, methane emissions in livestock, that are funding projects to take these inhibitor products and to come up with slow release delivery either through water technology or through slow release bolus technology. So these are things that will start becoming available in the next few years as options should the supply chain require you to be low emissions. But where I'd like to land is this Sarah Meal from University of Sydney produced a really interesting paper where they took some of these inhibitor products, 3-NOP in this particular case, which is a very effective inhibitor from DSM Nutrition. It'll be available in the market later this year in Australia. Very effective at reducing emissions. And they used it in this grey area here in the graph, where it actually shows that if you feed it to the cows and calves through the weaning phase and then stop feeding it, those calves remained 20% less methane for the rest of the measurement period, which is about another 60 days. So it gives us real hope that the long-term holy grail of this type of research is we can intervene once in a generation and set our herd on a course for lower methane emissions. So I guess I'm throwing these out saying there are things on the left that we can do now, and there are things on the right that are coming through that'll be available in the market by 2030 when we need to be lower methane. So just some links to the tools for carbon accounting, and we do run a 1.5-day carbon neutral agriculture training course where I go into a lot more detail. Peter, thank you. That's what I had to present.
Thank you, Richard. A lot of information there for our audience to unpack, so thank you. Very well articulated. I'm going to grab the screen back and we'll get into questions very shortly. Just bear with me as I switch over, everyone. And thank you for your patience tonight. I know we've had a number of technical difficulties, which are less than ideal. So thanks. Okay, and before we get into questions, just a reminder about the exit survey on the way out. And our next webinar will be in 2 weeks' time, where we're looking at key diseases to vaccinate for in cattle, and that'll be again a southern cattle or southern production region focus with Dr. Paul Nylon from Nylon Farm Health. In terms of further resources, MLA has highlighted these that you can access from their website, and as I put in the chat, all our webinars for this series are recorded. They're usually up within 2 to 3 working days, and you can grab it from the link there or copy the link out of the chat. So thank you again for your questions and tuning in tonight. I'll get into the first of them now, Richard. Okie dokie. Now, in terms of carbon accounting, is the amount of CO2 converted from the grass available to cattle or livestock factored into calculations?
No, so the reason why I showed you that animation, that whole of carbon cycle, is we could account it and it would come in on the left-hand side of the ledger as a massive pool of carbon. And within 12 months, it will leave the left-hand side of the ledger and go straight back to the atmosphere. There's no long-term sequestration of carbon taking place in the photosynthesis that's captured in pasture. It's highly transient. It comes in, it goes out, and that's how nature designed it to work. So that's why when we're doing carbon accounting, we're only concerned with what is hanging around. What is the carbon that comes in that doesn't leave the system? And that's trees, soil carbon, and methane. Unfortunately, those are the ones. We could do the accounting of all the carbon that comes in photosynthesis, but we just have to deduct it out on the other side of the ledger in 12 months. There's no long-term sequestration from that.
Okay. Next question relates to seaweed, the seaweed product. So it's a comment rather than a question, but I think you can still comment to it, talk to it, Richard. So the meta-analysis of seaweed of the seaweed, CSIRO seaweed product, published only shows that there's only a reduction of methane by 9%. Do you want to comment on, and
Yeah,
there are other papers out there, Richard, so could you talk to that?
yeah, look, we completed a full meta-analysis of all the papers available on 3-NOP and on seaweed, on Asparagopsis. The Asparagopsis in confinement systems where it's fed daily generally reduces methane by sort of 80% plus. So where the 9% comes from would be quite unusual in the data set. Having said that, it's probably worth commenting that the two products are made by the media to sort of appear equal. Yes, they both have high potential, but 3-NOP is actually in the market, ready to go with approvals from the EU, from the United States, New Zealand, South America. It's done its due diligence, and it's got about 48 peer-reviewed papers sitting behind it. The seaweed has a long road to go still in due diligence, as in it's got some fairly strong active ingredients in it that are the reason why it reduces methane. There's a lot of things about cultivation, about increasing the supply. The price is quite a lot higher than the 3-NOP. So just for the audience, they're both options, but seaweed is unlikely to be a viable option for the livestock industries for probably another 5 years, whereas the other one is right here now, ready to go by the end of this year.
Okay, thanks for the clarification there, Richard, because I think there is some confusion out there. Richard, a nice simple one. The links you put at the end of your presentation, people are asking about those, so I'll grab them off Richard, and if anyone puts in their comments or in questions that you're interested in this, I'll get that out to you via email. Next question from there is, in essence, farmers are largely given a market to provide sequestering offsets by virtue of energy generation that emits CO2, i.e., if that wasn't the case, i.e. 100% green energy, would we find it harder to sell sequestering credits?
I'm trying to sort of read the question there. If you're doing on-farm energy generation, I mean, that's a green energy you can sell. There's some good examples of, say, piggeries, large commercial piggeries in New South Wales that have covered their effluent ponds, and they're generating methane and selling green energy into the grid and getting renewable energy certificates. I mean, that's a very viable alternative. So for dairy in the future, you would see that being quite a viable alternative. For feedlots, you would see that being quite a viable alternative. Certainly, there's sort of a fair bit of interest in grazing sheep under solar panels, for example. Can we do solar farms and sheep and get maybe a shade benefit from heat stress with sheep? I'm sure there's compromises both ways. But in terms of other sales, you would have heard me harping on about selling other offsets. I do think are a bit dangerous. You can sell things like methane or nitrous oxide reductions if you can generate them, but selling sequestration, I suspect you just bank the co-benefits, because the co-benefits of storing soil carbon and the co-benefits of trees, if you let that drive your decision, those will be an order of magnitude more return to profitability than selling soil carbon, for example. Soil carbon doesn't store nitrogen. Soil carbon doesn't store water. Soil organic matter stores water. Soil organic matter stores nitrogen and releases nitrogen. So do soil organic matter, bank the productivity benefits, don't try and sell soil carbon.
I might reframe that question again, and Brad, please comment if this was your meaning. I think what the question means is, let's say we flicked the switch today, Richard, and we eliminated all CO2 from energy production. Would there still be, and it was all renewables with zero carbon footprint, will we still have a carbon market in that instance?
Yeah, look, we wouldn't have a carbon market. I think that's a very real fear for the agriculture sector. because right now agriculture is about 14% of global emissions. If we flip the switch and turned off all the coal-fired power stations and stopped using diesel, agriculture would be 98% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and the focus will come straight on agriculture to do their bit. So instead of getting us off the hook, I suspect it'll put us on the hook. Now, having said that, you know, the average livestock system in sort of semi-confinement can reduce their methane by the end of the next 5 years. We'll be reducing our emissions by 50%. That's a far cry better than what the fossil fuel industry is able to achieve in the next 5 years, unless we switch off the power stations, which we probably won't do for the next 20 years. So without sounding like doomsday, agriculture can probably end up being the leader rather than the laggard in this whole environment.
Okay. Now, if I might need to clarify some of these questions, so as Richard answers the next few, I'll come back to some of them online. Please clarify your question. Next question is, what's the potential for soil carbon storage in high rainfall areas? And I'll take it a step further for you, Richard. How does that differ comparative to capacity in arid or dry regions?
Yeah, look, you know, the work we've done on soil carbon would say rainfall and clay. That is, if you don't have rainfall, you don't have clay. So pretty much the soil properties, so clay determines the potential. The rainfall determines the actual. So you can have high potential, you could have a potential of 7% soil carbon, but if you don't have the rain, you can't get there. So if you're in arid areas and you've got good clay, you'll never get your 7% because the rainfall determines what you can get. And then what you actually have is management. So management can only shift you from where you are through to what the rainfall will limit you to achieve. But then to take the next step up, you'd need to be addressing rainfall. So if you're a grain producer at Geraldton, getting 1.5% soil carbon would be a fantastic outcome because they're low rainfall and they've got no clay. They've got sand. So you can't hold carbon without sand, with sand. If you're on the Liverpool Plains and you've got really good clay soils with reasonable rainfall, then you would be questioning yourself if you were 3% soil carbon because your potential could be 5. And you'd say, well, why aren't you 5? Well, you should be 5 because that's the potential you've got. So let's be careful about what we try. You know, if you're on a sandy soil, those granite ridges that are low rainfall, you simply can't build soil carbon there no matter what you do. Whereas if you've got a good clay soil with 750 millimeters of rainfall, you could build 6% soil carbon in that under permanent pasture. But then the question is, should we be rewarding farmers to go from 3% to 7% when 7% is where they should have been anyway? So there's kind of circular logic involved in the potential to build soil carbon, because if you can shift it, then why didn't you? Because all the profitability outcomes are all there for having the highest possible soil organic matter anyway.
All right, thank you. Now there's questions coming in thick and fast, which is great, guys. I will have to pull up at some point, so if we don't get to your question tonight, we will we'll answer it offline and come back to you. Good question here, Richard. We might dial it back a bit. So for a novice, can you explain the difference between the impact of methane and CO2 on the greenhouse, and how is this, I guess, discussed in the political arena? Is it accurate?
Yeah, so methane, all greenhouse gases are expressed in accounting terms and IPCC terms. They're expressed on a 100-year basis. So gases like CO2 and nitrous oxide, they last well over a few hundred years in the atmosphere. So a parcel of CO2 that goes to the atmosphere today is still there in 100 years' time. So 100 years is kind of a minimum time period. Methane's quite different in that it only lasts for about 14 years and then it oxidizes back to CO2 and water vapor. The problem is that while it's in the atmosphere, it's warming us at about 112 times that of CO2. So one parcel of methane is warming us 112 times more than a parcel of CO2. Now, because we put them all on a 100-year basis, methane gets a very severe discount. It gets a 28 times rather than 112, because we've all compared them on a 100-year basis. So effectively stretching out methane to 100 years recognizes it has a big impact while it's there, but it's gone in 14 years and not present. Now, there's been a lot of enthusiasm around saying, well, is the metric right? And other metrics have been proposed that people think will be much better. But when you really look at those new metrics, like a metric called GWP star, it says, take today's methane, let's penalize it with 112. But let's recognize methane from 20 years ago is gone. So let's give it a slightly smaller value and deduct it off. That works nicely when you've got a decreasing national sheep flock, which we have in Australia. But we didn't intend that. What if we recovered, what if the world wool price recovered and we're having increasing livestock numbers? Then every new animal gets the 112 times methane with nothing from 20 years ago to deduct off. So you've got to be really careful with how we play with metrics, in that these new metrics appear to favor us because we've got an inadvertent decrease in animal numbers. But if we were trying to recover the national herd from drought or from the national wool price, we would actually get severely penalized for every new animal in the system with this new metric. So you've got to look at it both ways and say, let's not just take the benefits while they're there. And, you know, the IPCC are never going to shift for that reason. So I say, let's not fiddle with the metrics. That's why I threw out the New Zealand target, which said, New Zealand said, we won't offer zero methane. We'll offer 47% less methane by 2050. And the whole world said, fine, we'll accept that because that's what you're offering. So to try and fiddle the metrics to get a better view of livestock is viewed as greenwashing, whereas New Zealand went the other way and said, we just won't offer zero methane, and the whole world said, fine. I think that's a far better way to go if you think about it, where methane doesn't have to be zero because of the way it behaves in the atmosphere. So if you think about the short-term nature of methane, if you just had it decreasing by 40% by 2050, it achieves the same level of reduction in warming, so the same level of warming ambition as stopping all CO2 tomorrow. So methane doesn't have to be zero. Let's not fiddle with the metric.
Yep, good. Thank you, Richard. Now this is a great question here, and bear with me. I'll try and paraphrase because it's a little bit long. So this producer has experience in a number of audits with the assistance of Steve Wiedemann. Hopefully I got the pronunciation right there.
That's correct.
So generally the audits were on livestock operations already applying best practice, so improved genetics, perennial pastures, direct drilled, high stocking rates, you know, etc. I'm not clear here in this question whether they planted trees, etc. But what the comment is on the bulk of these operations, they were carbon negative, except for a couple of operations who had about 30% of their area as natural, I'm assuming, environment. So it doesn't really quite quantify what kind of natural bush area. So obviously producers can't remove large sections of area for tree planting or natural environment and be viable. What's the alternative, do you believe, for those who are already applying best practice? Richard?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things there. One, you know, there's a lot of frustration out there from those that are already applying best practice in terms of weaning rates and fertility and all that. I understand that, and that's, you know, the left-hand do now column, you probably do, some of you are doing that all already. Trees are an interim solution, but we also know that for a farm at 20 DSC, for example, in Western Victoria, we'd need 20% of the farm under trees, and we'd need to repeat that every 20 years. There's probably one caveat in trees that no one's really sort of promoted much, and that is the fundamental difference when we shifted from Kyoto rules to the Paris Climate Agreement. Paris said, offer what you can, offer a bottom up. We'll take whatever you can offer. If New Zealand says they won't offer zero methane, we'll take that. And so what it did is it freed us up to say, well, do you plant trees permanently and then they age at 30 years and they're no longer locking up carbon and you've lost that land? Or do you say, well, under that same scenario, you only need 7% of the farm under fast-growing spotted gum, and you harvest it every 25 years and put it into construction timber, and 40% of that carbon stored in the trees is permanent sequestration that you can continue to claim while you replant and you get paid for the timber. That is actually emerging as a very viable solution, as an interim solution, until these longer-term methane reduction strategies really come through as viable. So I would say, you know, timber is not, it's not about planting the whole landscape to trees anymore. It's actually saying, well, what can we do on some of the land to generate diversified income from timber and carbon offsets that will make the whole farm carbon neutral with less land, and it's not dead land, if you know what I mean. I think that's emerging as a viable option.
Okay, good question, and thanks, Richard. That example, that scenario really clears that up. Okay, so I've got a few to go. Hopefully, Richard, if we could just churn these out, we'll get to every one of them. I don't want to put you under too much pressure. So, producer here, in the short term, is it correct we would be better off turning off lambs at higher growth rates via supplementary feeding or grain feeding to reduce our carbon footprint?
Yeah, I'd say yes at the moment, because it definitely, the age at which they turn off is far more material than the extra emissions from buying in grain, for example. Grain comes at, you know, 0.5 ton of greenhouse emissions per ton of grain. So it's really quite inconsequential in the big equation compared to methane. So if you're turning those animals off a month earlier because you fed them grain to finish them off quicker, that would be a far lower overall footprint than taking longer and feeding them on lower quality. Viable option.
Okay. Now, this question, not clear to me, maybe it'll be clear to you, Richard. So if net zero targets equal carbon emissions minus carbon absorption, and our total emissions are 430, I'm not sure if it's metric ton or million ton per year, Richard. What are our national carbon absorption capacity at present? What is, I don't know.
Yeah, look, I mean, I couldn't answer the question with numbers. I would suggest caution when it comes to the idea that the land can just absorb the carbon. Reason why I say that is there's calculations the government does around our total carbon flux in the landscape. We don't get to see those numbers much, but go through a drought and our carbon stocks in Australia crash across the landscape. Go through a La Nina and they all increase dramatically. And so we could probably make a statement saying the eastern seaboard of Australia has sequestered more soil carbon in the last La Nina 18 months than it did in the previous 4 years put together. But then we'll lose it all in the next La Nina season. So the notion that the soils can solve the problem or that trees will grow to solve the problem really doesn't work when it comes to variability, because rainfall and rainfall cycles have an overriding impact on the net balance. So I think this is a discussion we've had because we've sort of thinking, well, let the land absorb all our fossil fuel emissions, and I think that's coming to an end as an idea.
Great, thanks, Richard. Now, Richard, I'm going to paraphrase this next question again. So obviously there's a lot of theoretical calculations out there for methane emissions and CO2. How is that theory field tested? So, you know, the producer here is asking, can we do it out in the paddock with satellites, drones, etc.? Perhaps you could talk through some of the UC Davis shed work and ruminant trials there as an example, Richard.
Yeah, this is something that's becoming more a community projects that we're seeing emerging, where groups of farmers are getting together saying, can we buy one green feed unit between us and just share it between us, so that we can just move it between properties and park it in the paddock and get our methane emissions. That's quite viable. You know, yes, they are expensive, but if there's a community effort to say, well, we want to know what our actual methane is, and this unit can do it, then let's consider that. So I think these types of regional or within farm type measurements are becoming more and more popular. The way we do it in research is extremely expensive. Putting animals in a sealed chamber and measuring all the gases in and out, you know, you get no change out of $300,000 to measure methane over a 6-week period. But that's research. When it comes to technologies that are now in the paddock, like infrared gas analyzers and these green feed units, yeah, I think we will see more of them emerge more at a community level. When you as a producer say, I'm doing something different and I need some numbers to say I'm doing something different other than the 20.7 times dry matter intake, I think the imperative becomes there to say, well, let me get, you know, I've bought some grape mark from South Australia. I know my emissions are 20% less. I need some numbers to say that. And there are some ways to do that are emerging.
Okay. Guys, I am going to pull up on any further new questions now. Richard's been very generous with his time. Richard, a couple that we should be able to get through fairly quickly. Farmers out of this are wondering whether they should go and complete carbon audits now, and are they missing opportunities potentially by not doing that?
Yeah, I'd say yes, do a carbon audit. You can do the belt and braces approach where you get an auditor in to do that, but you could also just go to our website and download the tool and fill it out yourself and get a baseline. I'd say more important than the carbon audit itself, though, is to make sure you've got the data to fill in the carbon audit. That might sound stupid, but as long as you've got a history of the data required at any stage in the future, if someone wanted to say, well, we need to know that your number is changing, we don't care what it is today, but we want to know what was last year, then at least you've got the data to fill out a carbon audit over a time period. So make yourself aware of what data is required for a carbon audit, even if you don't do the full carbon audit. Sounds silly to say that, but I think it's more important to know that, to have a record, so you can say, in 2010, this was the numbers of animals I had, this is how much fertilizer I applied, this is how much energy I used, therefore we can calculate that at any time in the future and say this was your carbon audit at that time. I would also say keep good soil sample data and include soil organic matter as part of your normal soil testing, so that you have a benchmark on what your soil organic matter is doing over time.
Okay, excellent. Okay, and without labouring the point here, Richard, this constantly comes up in these events, so I think we'll revisit it one more time. Still, producers are still wondering. We understand that there's no long-term sequestering from photosynthesis. What they're still struggling to understand is why, obviously, with differences in systems, it's still not accounted for in the ledger. So yeah, again, we can be held to account for methane potentially if we measure it on farm, but then again, the sequestering on farm will be different depending on the crop, etc.
Yeah, so if you are sequestering more in your pasture, then you will produce more livestock product and your emissions intensity will go down. That's where you get the reward for more sequestration. The carbon itself is neutral. There's no point in accounting for it because it is not there 12 months later. So like I said earlier, it'll come in, it'll go out. And where you get the reward for being better at sequestering carbon is through growing a 20-ton pasture rather than a 15-ton pasture, or a 6-ton crop rather than a 2.5-ton crop. And then sending more of that per unit of greenhouse gas emission, more of it down the supply chain. So more lambs down the supply chain means the overhead of methane is fairly constant, but you grew more pasture and therefore were able to send more product out the system, so your emissions footprint is lower. That's where the reward lies, not actually in counting carbon that's here today and gone tomorrow. We can do that, but it'll be a massive exercise to count the carbon in and the carbon out, but it's a net zero-sum game, so no point in doing it. Like I said, with the benefit you would get is more photosynthesis, more effective capture in the plant or the crop, means a more effective farming system, and therefore more soil carbon and more translation down the supply chain, and that's where your reward lies.
Yeah, I think that's the take home for this webinar. So thank you, Richard, for clarifying that again. We've got a Kiwi online, and I guess are farm assessments available in New Zealand, to your knowledge?
Yeah, look, there's tools across the board in New Zealand. There's tools like Farmax, there's tools like Overseer, there's tools like there's a beef tool, Hoofprint. Hoofprint is another tool in New Zealand. So there's, I think at last count there was something like 15 carbon accounting tools available in New Zealand, all with validity. So almost a confusing landscape, really. But the bottom line for the Kiwis, sorry about this, but while it's still voluntary for us to do a carbon audit in New Zealand, if you haven't done it by the end of this calendar year, you will be locked into the ETS and required to account for your emissions. So I would advise you find out one of those tools and do your carbon audit.
All right. Richard, I might try and sneak the final two in. Are you comfortable with that?
All good.
Okay. Now, the final one is slightly off topic, but have you viewed the Ville Burrows report delivered in May? And it's about the Australian being, for those in the audience who don't know the reports, about Australia already being net zero emissions. Do you think this is valid?
Yeah, look, what it really comes back to is because we've put more pollution in the atmosphere, because we've got more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, there's good evidence that our trees are growing faster as a result. And so the idea is that because the trees have been growing faster, we've got more bush encroachment into our agricultural areas, that those trees are growing faster and therefore have absorbed enough CO2 to offset our emissions. First of all, that's already accounted for in our greenhouse accounts. But secondly, that'll never fly on international accounting, because actually we are asking the world to say, trust us, our pollution has made our trees grow faster, and therefore we don't have to reduce our emissions because the trees that we have polluted are growing faster. It just doesn't fly from an integrity point of view. Secondly, there's also good information that that effect is now plateaued. In other words, we've produced more CO2. We're up at 450 parts per million CO2, and this elevated CO2 response that's making trees grow faster has stopped. Trees have done their bit; they won't do any more. So we can bank it this time around, but actually it still means net zero is an imperative because we can't keep doing it.
Okay. And nice simple one to close out the night, Richard. So cold pressed canola meal, and I guess this could apply to any feed additive where we've got claims. Do you see it's been claimed to reduce methane emissions in cattle? Is that consistent across ruminants, so the same effect in sheep? And is there a difference between different additives and their effect on methane reduction between ruminant species?
Yeah, we did a lot of work on oils, on all different types of oils, and did a sort of global analysis that now underpins one of the carbon offset methods by government. Pretty much you can guarantee any vegetable oil of any sort, cold pressed canola, hominy meal, cottonseed oil, even grape mark. For every 1% extra oil you poke into the rumen, doesn't matter what ruminant you put it in, you're getting about 3.5% less methane. Up to about 7% maximum oil you can feed in a ruminant. So it gives you the scope to supplement with an oil seed somewhere up to that 7% and get somewhere up to 20% less methane. That is a viable option and a low risk option. The only flaw is everybody else wants vegetable oils now and are willing to pay more than agriculture can.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you for everyone who's still online and for sticking around. Richard, thanks for your time and your insights tonight and taking all those questions in. A reminder, survey on the way out. And I guess I'm getting lots of thanks, and what a great presentation, Richard. So thank you again, and see you all in 2 weeks' time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. How are you going with bandwidth there? You